Hello and welcome viewers, I am Pia and you're watching NewsX World, and here are the top headlines this hour. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says that no Russian strike will go unpunished after deadly attacks on Kiev and southern Ukraine. He's praised long-range Neptune missiles and has urged more air defense support from partners as civilian casualties continue to rise. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has condemned Russia's latest wave of large-scale missile and drone strikes in Ukraine, which reportedly killed at least 8 people and caused widespread damage across several regions. He's added that such attacks violate international humanitarian law. US President Donald Trump lifts tariffs on beef, coffee and other agricultural products to stabilize prices and ease inflation. The move affects products like tomatoes, bananas, aligning with recent agreements with Ecuador, Argentina and other countries. US President Donald Trump says that he has decided how to proceed on Venezuela. This comes as top Trump administration officials, military and senior staff gathered at the White House for at least the third day in a row to discuss possible military operations. US Vice President J.D. Vance says that Donald Trump recognizes the need to negotiate with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin despite their differences. This comes as a meeting between Trump and Putin in Budapest was cancelled earlier. US President Donald Trump says that China will buy US soybeans and other farm goods, adding that both sides held talks on the 14th of November. Trump expects purchases to begin before spring, though he did not identify which officials were involved in the discussions. US President Donald Trump has stated that he would likely sue the BBC next week for as much as $5 billion after the British broadcaster admitted it wrongly edited a video of a speech he gave but insisted that there was no legal basis for his claim. 9 people have been killed and 29 injured after a massive accidental blast at the Nowgam police station in Srinagar in India. The explosion occurred while forensic teams handled seized explosives linked to a terror module, leaving widespread damage and shock waves that were felt kilometers away. Well, viewers, those were the headlines and our top focus. The UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees has urged for the entry of sheltering materials into the Gaza Strip as heavy rain floods tens of displaced civilians amid dire humanitarian conditions. According to the Gaza Civil Defense Ministry, dozens of tents sheltering displaced Palestinians were flooded in Al-Mawasi in the southern city of Khan Yunis. Since early Friday, the Gaza Strip has been under a low-pressure system accompanied by a cold air mass and heavy rainfall, compounding the suffering of those who've been displaced, about 1.5 million civilians in the war-torn enclave. This comes as the Israeli blockade of the entry of shelter materials such as tents and mobile homes continue, which of course need to be met under obligations under the ceasefire agreement that was entered into force on the 10th of October. on that note, viewers, we're shifting focus to more news coming in this time from Sudan. We're now learning that displaced Sudanese families have arrived at a UN refugee camp in the town of Tawila after escaping the famine-stricken Darfur city of Al-Fasher. New arrivals were registered by UNHCR before setting up tents and temporary shelters, joining thousands already seeking safety as conditions deteriorate across the region. Aid assessments conducted before this latest influx have found that only 10% of people in Tawila's camps had reliable access to water, with even fewer having access to proper latrines. The influx is now placing additional strain on already limited humanitarian resources. Now, the conflict between the Sudanese army and the paramilitary rapid support forces has escalated into what the United Nations now describes as the world's largest humanitarian crisis, worsened by shrinking global aid budgets. Now, as of mid-October, which is about a month back, an estimated 12.5 million Sudanese had been displaced both within and outside the country, with another 140,000 people recently forced to flee RSF attacks on El Fasher and towns in the Kordofan region as well. With us on the broadcast is Ms. Shruti Dasgupta, International Affairs expert, joining us from New Delhi. Thank you so much for taking our time and speaking to us on NewsX World. Day by day, we're seeing this crisis in Sudan continue to escalate. The UN has come out with its report stating that more than 100,000 people have now fled El Fasher after the RSF had taken control. The RSF has of course carried out summary executions, sexual violence as well. We've seen those satellite images with piles and piles of dead bodies and blood literally visible by those satellite images as well on the roads. In spite of all of this, and the Trump administration trying to move the ceasefire plan, we're seeing the RSF trying to push eastwards towards Kordofan, which eventually is the route to Khartoum.
You're absolutely right. Sudan is facing a massive crisis, but that's not a new one. It has been facing crisis since 1989, since where it went through a dictatorship for 30 years. But when it did gain a democratic government, it was toppled within 2 years. And since then, it has been in a constant state of war. And because it is not in the first world, this conflict has not gained the kind of eyebrows and actions that it deserves. I believe the RSF has also been told that has also been observed to be burning people, body, and then burying the remains. A very inhuman act, just so that they can prevent the genocide act that could trigger massive sanctions against them, or even have them reported as a terrorist group rather than a militia. So what we see is a struggle for control. Unfortunately, the Sudanese army, even though it has the locals fighting for them, other warring tribes joining them, they are not as much in control of the situation as they should have been. And the RSF is gaining traction every single day. And unfortunately for all of us, this particular action has led to a large number of people fleeing their homes just because the color of their skin is not light enough. And that should be shameful for a world that is claiming to be in the 21st century and beyond the language we speak or the color of our skin. So it's a very shameful act. UN is right to trigger alarms. US is right to ask that the arms supply through whichever vendor is going through should be stopped. There should be sanctions in place so that at least some semblance of peace can be seen. Otherwise, we will have another nation just destroying itself under the rule of the gun.
Absolutely. Since you've spoken about the arms supply, we do know that the United Arab Emirates does have its interests in backing the RSF. There have been several reports that have come to light. Of course, there was also a report in 2024 by the United Nations that had detailed the same. What are the UAE's considerations? It is a food insecure country itself, and there are a lot of murmurs going around that some of its top agro processing businesses have invested in Sudan and therefore are backing the RSF in order to gain as much profit as possible, because the the area itself, the country itself is very resource rich, not just agriculturally, but also in terms of oil, natural gas, gold.
You're absolutely right. Unfortunately, all of it always boils down to the resources a nation or the land has, and the weakness of the government that can be there, and the fault lines that can be exploited by more powerful nations. UAE, of course, has extended its support, at least verbally, to USA's proposal of banning arms towards RSF. That is a minor step there, that at least they're willing to acknowledge that it might be a graver situation than they are willing to take on their conscience. But the oil reserves, when South Sudan's kind of separated from Sudan itself, the oil reserves are not as extensive as they used to be, but the gold is a large, Sudan would be the third largest manufacturer in Africa of gold. And so there is a lot to be exploited from that particular nation, and as long as it continues in the state of civil war, the people that are controlling these strings of power, they are able to exploit the resources as much as possible, and the human cost is not something that they would actually take into account in their profit margins. So this is a sad state of affair, and I hope UAE steps up and stops backing a nation where the RSF, which is now the gaining force in Sudan, is able to continue its massacre of people without facing consequences.
Indeed, and I'd like to ask a quick follow-up to this, because we've recently seen a meeting between the UAE president and the president of the Republic of Chad, Mohamed Idris Deby Itno. Interestingly, UAE and Chad are discussing trade and investments, but we do know that Chad borders Sudan to the west. It is the province which is right next to Darfur. A lot of people say that the weapons supply, the arms supply to the RSF takes place through Chad. What more can you add to this?
Well, let's look at Darfur itself. That is where let's say the genealogy or the legacy of RSF is the Janjaweed. If I'm not Janjaweed is the right name. That was the militia group earlier that worked under under that dictator. I'm forgetting his name. Please pardon me. But for the 30 years that was the dictator of Sudan, the Janjaweed were working right there. They held ethnic cleanses in Darfur, and the world had closed their eyes and ears to that travesty. So it continues that legacy. They take on new names under new forms of dictators, or they plan to be one themselves. And no matter what, although Chad is close to it, and we know that there is a problem, it can also play an important role in showing that the world does not stand with genocide. So I hope that the trade meetings included a little bit of Sudan's humanity problem as far as UAE is concerned.
Absolutely, ma'am. Requesting you to stay on with us as we're tracking some further updates. We're shifting our focus away from Africa, Sudan in particular, towards what's happening in Europe. A government official has now stated that Serbia has obtained a 3-month reprieve on sanctions affecting its Russian-owned oil company, the NIS, easing concerns over potential fuel shortages ahead of winter. Now, earlier this week, Serbia had disclosed that Russia's Gazprom Neft and Gazprom, which jointly control 56% of NIS, had submitted a request to the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, indicating their readiness to relinquish control of the company to a third party. OFAC had first sanctioned Russia's oil sector, including Gazprom, back in January for implementation. But implementation for NIS was delayed multiple times before finally taking effect on the 8th of October. Meanwhile, the temporary extension offers Serbia critical breathing room as it works to secure stable fuel supplies during the winter months. Stay with us on the broadcast is Ms. Shruti Dasgupta, International Affairs expert. We'd recently seen a 1-year reprieve being granted to Orban of Hungary and now Serbia as well. What do you make of these U.S. moves and the fact that, Gazprom had to submit a request to the U.S. Treasury's office to realize this?
Well, okay, let's backtrack a little and say Gazprom has said that they'll hand over their 56% interest to a third party. But who's that third party? We do not know. It might just turn out to be another shell company, or
Yes.
it might turn out to be a supporter of the Russian cause. And so it is just going to probably change hands on the face of it, but it does save Serbia from these critical sanctions, which were impacting the people. The locals, not so much, because they would trade in the local currency, but I believe they had people standing on the ground trying to help people pump their fuel, and they found like 1 in 10 person was impacted by these sanctions. So that's not a large amount, but still significant enough to its trade. Beyond it, they have, because of this, they have also not been able, Serbia has not been able to secure its gas deal with Russia, and they do need gas because Russia would sell them gas at a very, very low cost. And though they have gas of their own, they would probably not have the capacity to to fuel their own nation, and probably not be able to provide it at the prices that Russia was providing it. So they are right now in a very tight spot with regarding the gas. Serbia also has a problem with Russia because Russia is not happy with the way its arms, its defense manufacturing is indirectly being routed to Ukraine. So although they're not directly selling to Ukraine, they sell it to a third party and it gets rerouted. So there are tensions between Serbia and Russia that are happening. And although these particular nations, many of them have secured reprieve, and they get reprieve conditionally. I do not know what are the underlying conditions of it. But overline is that they need to depend on Russian energy resources. So despite what is being said on the airwaves that Russia is being strangled by the sanctions and all of that, each European nation is dependent despite the war now heading towards its 4th year. So they've not been able to set up an alternate system to counter Russia and its energy hold that it has on Europe. And US sanctions hurts its own allies more than it hurts Russia, and hence the reprieves that are being handed out one after the other.
Indeed. And do you think now the Trump administration has come to understand this with the reprieves that are being handed out? Because you cannot change geographic reality.
That is indeed true. You cannot sit on another continent and then decide what happens in this one without actually having to lose allies. And that is a reality that USA faced, that if its allies are trapped into a position where they have no choice but to go begging on their knees to Russia, it doesn't look good for USA or those particular nations. So by granting them sanctions, USA looks like a more benevolent power that is willing to be more accommodating of its weaker allies and their needs. But in reality, had they actually thought it through, these sanctions would have never come out, because once you make a big statement, but then you're constantly pulling it back, you're going to have to pull back for almost all nations at this rate. What is the fault of any other nation per se? For example, Germany is getting it, but France is not, and Denmark is not getting it, but now we say that Serbia is. So there are nations that are facing sanctions for using Russian energy. India is facing sanctions for using Russian energy. How do you justify sanctions on other nations while you grant a reprieve to a small select few? So this doesn't look good for USA. It shows that the sanctions are deliberately weaponized. So maybe USA should rethink its entire sanction policy and actually find a way to end the war to benefit all parties without hurting its allies in their economic pockets.
Indeed. And coming back to Serbia itself, how is this likely to affect the domestic fuel prices and the energy security of Serbia, especially with winter around the corner?
They get the 3-month reprieve. This is exactly the reason why they've got it, because they need the fuel for the severe winters that is going to set in. And without the fuel coming in from Russia, they are going to be in a very, very bad situation. So they've got it for the oil. The gas thing has not materialized, so they have not re-signed the pact that they had with Russia. So that is going to be the pinch that they will feel for allowing their ammunition to be controlled by the Western powers and for allowing their policies to be guided by US sanctions. So Russia knows how to tighten the tap, and that's exactly what they're going to do now with Serbia. Probably make an example out of it in a more specific way. so that the people who are dependent on Russia understand that they cannot be puppets on USA's strings without paying for it in their own way.
Absolutely, ma'am. With that, I'd like to thank you for taking out time, of course, putting all of that into perspective for our viewers. On that note, we're shifting focus away from Europe towards some news coming in from Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia. A landslide in Indonesia's central Java has killed 6 people, with 17 now missing as per reports. The landslide has occurred in the city of Cilacap. It's buried a dozen houses in Sibeyungying village. Now, the Southeast Asian nation's wet season started in September and will last until April, bringing a high risk of floods and extreme rainfall in many areas as per its weather agency. In January itself, a landslide triggered by torrential rain in another central city of Java, Pekalongan, killed at least 25 people. More news coming in back from the European Union. We are learning that the EU is preparing to roll back parts of its artificial intelligence and data protection framework. The move comes amid a strong pushback from industry groups in Europe and the United States. The EU Commission says that the aim is to reduce red tape for businesses competing with US and Chinese tech firms. It further argues that simplifying digital rules will make it easier for European companies to access user data needed for AI development. Moreover, the plan also includes removing widely disliked cookie consent banners. According to draft documents released, the EU Commission is expected to propose a 1-year pause in the implementation of parts of the AI law and changes to its General Data Protection Regulation program. And these changes would narrow the definition of personal data and allow companies to use such data to train AI models under a claim of legitimate interest. Now, rights groups and lawmakers have been raising alarms in these changes, stressing that this could reduce privacy protections. Additionally, more than 100 groups, including privacy advocates, have warned that the plan represents a major step backward for digital rights. But as far as the EU Commission is concerned, it maintains a firm stance on the proposal. Officials say that their goal is not to lower privacy standards, but these changes are part of a broader effort to reduce administrative burdens in technological development. They also deny any external pressure from Washington. Well, viewers, due to paucity of time, that's all we have for this particular bulletin. We will continue to track more such updates. Stay tuned on NewsX World as we dip into a quick short break.